Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas are entering this offseason on the hot seat. What do they need to do to get off it? We'll talk about it today. It's Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, March 6th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Today, we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Obviously, with the offseason unofficially beginning next week with free agency getting underway in just a couple days, most of the questions are tailored towards the Jets offseason. Our first question, however, deals with Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. And it goes, what do you think it takes for JD and Saleh to get contract extensions? Now, I think there's no question about it. Woody Johnson even kind of alluded to this a few weeks back that Jets need to win this year. Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh enter 2024 on the hot seat. Saleh entering year 4, Douglas entering what I guess you could call year 6 technically, even though like that first year, it wasn't really his team because they hired him essentially after the offseason was over. But Douglas, as far as we know, is entering the final year of his contract. And that's kind of unusual. I'm surprised the Jets have not given him some sort of token 1-year contract extension. At least I haven't heard anything that's been publicized. Maybe it's possible something's happened under the radar, but we don't know about it right now if it did. And so Douglas entering the final year of his contract, it's very unusual to have a GM in the final year of his contract. And I think that the simple answer to this is probably playoffs or bust. I think if Jets make the playoffs this year, they probably get extended. Now, there could be an exception. If it's like a really soft playoff berth, if it's like they sneak in at 9-8 and get the 7 seed and get blown out by the 2 seed in the first round, then I think they may end up, getting fired anyway. But I think generally speaking, it's probably either make the playoffs, end the 13-year playoff drought, or they get fired. I think maybe a broader way to think about this is they're probably here as long as Aaron Rodgers is here. And I think that how 2024 goes will determine whether Rodgers is here for 2025. If Rodgers has a good season, Jets are probably going to win some games. Jets will probably make the playoffs. And, if the Jets show competitiveness, I think that, based on what we're hearing right now, there's a pretty good chance Rodgers can come back for one more season in 2025. If it's a rough season, it's very possible Rodgers leaves. Rodgers just retires. I think whenever you're dealing with somebody in his 40s, it's always a year-to-year proposition. Rodgers has expressed interest in playing 2 more years, but it always depends on what actually happens that season. Now, I think part of the reason Saleh and Douglas are going to be here as long as Rodgers is just the way the owner has responded to Rodgers. Woody Johnson's pretty much made it clear that Aaron Rodgers is running this team. Whatever Aaron Rodgers wants, Aaron Rodgers gets. The way the Jets have operated since Rodgers came here is much more akin to the way an NBA team operates than an NFL team. In the NBA, if you can get a superstar player, generally that player has a lot of sway over the guys you go get in free agency. There's a lot of sway over, a lot of aspects of the organization. And that's kind of the way the Jets have treated Rodgers. Any guy that he's wanted, they've tried to go out and get. They went out and got Lazard. They went out and got Randall Cobb. Why is Nathaniel Hackett still here? Certainly not because he's a good coach. It's because Rodgers wants him here. And this goes beyond what you typically see in an NFL team. Typically if you have a quarterback of some stature, he has input. It's just common sense. You're talking about going out and signing a receiver. You may ask, hey, what do you think of this guy? You get your quarterback's input. But generally, it's not you just give him whatever he wants. Generally, it's you consider what the quarterback wants versus other factors. And if all things are equal, if there are 2 guys out there, equal in talent, you think they fit your scheme equally well, they're going to cost about the same amount of money. What the quarterback tells you could end up breaking the tie. And this is part of why I think Saleh and Douglas are here as long as Rodgers is, because I don't think anybody you'd bring in would agree to that. I think the only people who would agree to these conditions are people who are just desperate to keep their job, like Saleh and Douglas are right now. You bring in, like, and I've heard the idea. A couple people have floated it. Even like one pretty prominent writer floated the idea the Jets should fire Saleh and bring in Mike Vrabel. And look, I can't say I disagree with that. I think Vrabel's a better coach than Saleh. I don't think much of Saleh as a head coach. I think Vrabel's, Vrabel actually might be a little over. Like, people are talking about Vrabel like he's listed this iconic coach, like he's a top 5 coach. I don't agree with that, but he's a quality coach. I would not have any issue with the Jets bringing him in. Knows how to run the game effectively. Did a good job with Tennessee. A lot to like about Mike Vrabel. But Mike, what do you think Mike Vrabel is going to do if the Jets try to offer him this job and say, "Hey, you got to keep Nathaniel Hackett here because Aaron Rodgers wants him"? It's going to be like, no way. Now, that's not to say that, any coach or GM who's going to come in is going to throw Rodgers to the curb. I think, a lot of these guys are going to say, "Hey, let's go with Rodgers. He's the best guy we got." But they're not going to do everything Rodgers wants them to do. They're going to, of course, take Rodgers' input. And this is the thing, like, I think a lot of the people in the media don't get, is that there's a fine line between listening to a guy's input and just doing whatever he wants because he's asked for it. I've seen a couple of people defend the Jets saying, like, of course you seek the quarterback's input. Of course, that's not a debate. A quarterback of Rodgers' stature, his input does matter, but it's input. It's not what makes the whole decision. So I think ultimately, these guys are probably going to be here as long as Rodgers is here because they were kind of part of the plan. Now, do I think that Rodgers is a guy who, like, went and pounded the table late last year and said, "You better not fire Saleh or I'm retiring"? No, I don't. Do I think, like, Rodgers would, like, actually have a big issue with it if the Jets, just took his input instead of doing whatever he wanted? I'm not even sure. That's one of the things is, like, I don't think it's so much Rodgers is demanding these things and saying, "I'm retiring if you don't do this." I mean, there was the reported list he gave last year of the guys he wanted, and Lazard and Cobb were on that list, but so was Odell Beckham Jr., so was Mercedes Lewis. Jets didn't get Beckham or Lewis. Those guys signed with other teams. It's not like Rodgers, lost his mind or anything. I think it's more that the Jets are afraid to, like, just ask Rod. It's more like they're afraid of upsetting him, so they don't even approach these topics than it is that Rodgers is making demands. But I think a lot of this goes into, what we'll see this offseason. And the thing I don't love heading into this offseason, to be honest with you, is that these guys know that they need to win to keep their jobs. And I think in many ways, the success of Rodgers is going to be tied to the success of the team in 2024. Rodgers has a good season. The Jets will probably, make the playoffs. They'll probably have a successful year. If Rodgers shows signs of decline coming off the injury, the Jets are probably not going to have a successful season. They'll probably lose games. And success or failure this year is what will determine whether Saleh or Douglas get extensions. Now, Douglas is going to stay. He's going to have to get an extension because he's in the last year of his contract. So, if they let the contract expire, he's going to leave. So he'll have to get an extension. But Saleh, I think, is also seeking an extension. We're nearing the end of his deal. And, I don't think he'll want to enter the last year of his contract if he can avoid it. So Jets are, I think by the end of this year, the Jets are going to make a decision. And either these guys are going to be gone or they're going to be here for a few years longer. And, I don't love the incentive structure we've created because we've essentially made this year very, very important for Douglas and Saleh. And I think it's really, really dangerous when the long-term health of the team does not align with what's best for the GM and the front office career-wise, but GM and head coach career-wise, but kind of where the Jets are right now. Now, one thing the Jets are going to need to have a successful season is to upgrade their offensive line. We've talked about a lot of potential offensive linemen they could sign on the show, but there's one guy we haven't really talked about who could be available, who could be a fit. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about who that is and why he might be the right fit for the Jets as they look to upgrade up front on the offense. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Again, that's $150 if your bet wins. If you're an NBA fan, the regular season is, starting to wind down. We're not quite at the playoffs yet, but you can kind of see it off in the distance. Players are battling for potential awards. Teams are battling for playoff position. Some teams are just trying to get into playoff positioning. It's an exciting time in the NBA as we move towards the finish. And right now on FanDuel, you can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Again, quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This is a big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Next question. Hey, John, with all the talk of potential tackles and free agency, I have not heard you or anyone else talk about the idea of pursuing Jonah Williams, relatively young former first-round pick. Seems like a typical Joe Douglas target. Do you think he'd be a good fit for the Jets? What are your thoughts? That's a really interesting idea. We've talked about a lot of the veterans who could be available, a lot of the guys that should avoid, like Bakhtiari. My goodness, please do not sign David Bakhtiari. Jonah Williams, former first-round pick, is available. And you're right. I mean, Joe Douglas in free agency does like to bet on draft pedigree. And he likes to find guys who maybe, aren't awful players. He avoids, he doesn't sign guys who are just outright busts, but he signs guys who are, NFL caliber players who maybe have played below the level you'd expect in a first round pick. And he tries to kind of buy low on them and see if, if the Jets can get something out of them, if the Jets can get a good value out of them. And frankly, it hasn't worked a whole lot. But, Jonah Williams is going to be available. Now, as always, it's going to depend on the price. And, one of the things you find is like the first day or two of free agency, that's when the big money goes out. The reason guys sign on the first 2 days of free agency is like they get offers that are so big from desperate teams that it makes no sense for them to even negotiate them. A lot of these other guys, they have to negotiate their deal because, the team may be offering a little less than they want, so they have to go back and forth for a couple of days. A guy who gets signed the first day or two of free agency, it's just like such a good offer. They're just like, I can't, we can't do better than this. We got to take it. The question is whether Jonah Williams will be one of those guys. Is there going to be some team that just, because it only takes one team. It takes one team to be desperate. It takes one team to just fall in love with a guy, one team to think, we can fix this guy. And Jonah Williams is getting a crazy contract. Now, if Jonah Williams falls into like that second wave of free agency, that is an interesting idea. I think for a couple of reasons. And I go back to something I've been talking about on the show is like, I don't want the Jets to head into the NFL draft desperate at any position. And one of the challenges is, the tackle spot's not easy to fill. In Jonah Williams, you have a guy who's not a great tackle. The guy who's a credible, he's not going to destroy you if he's at tackle. You're not going to love it. He's not going to be a great player. He's probably not going to be an all-pro. But he's a guy who plays effectively enough. And he's got experience at left and right tackle. I'm not thrilled if he's my left tackle next season. But at least it's not like putting Max Mitchell out there. At least it's a guy who's got experience, a guy who's got a pretty good track record as a pass blocker, if nothing else. If you get him, it gives you flexibility heading into the draft. Because then look, I still think you need a left. I still don't know left tackle. You can say left tackle's not a need. But, it's like you at least have a plan B. It may not be the greatest plan B in the world, but at least it's there. At least like if you don't draft a tackle, it's not doomsday anymore. And, especially if if Alton and Fashanu are gone and you end up with Fuaga, I think Fuaga is really a guy who is going to be stuck on the right side. Then at least you have a credible option there. And the other thing I'd say is that if Jonah Williams falls into like that second wave of free agency and it comes cheap, that might be the kind of guys the Jets need to get because they need to find 3 offensive linemen. Really, the only 2 guys who are guaranteed to be starters on this team of the offensive line who are already on the roster are Joe Tippmann and AVT. And the Jets don't have that much cap space when you factor in everything they need because they don't just need 3 offensive linemen, which could be tough enough. They're going to need to add receivers. They're going to need to add a couple defensive tackles. They'll probably, they may need to add a safety. There are spots that the Jets don't have a lot of money to spend given all their needs. And I think like if the Jets are going to fix this offensive line, you can talk about the big names all you want, but what they're really going to have to do is they're going to probably have to hit on some middle tier free agents, some like middle class type free agents, guys who aren't going to get the big bucks, guys who maybe not have the big resumes. And the thing about the offensive line is part of offensive line play is talent, but even if you don't have elite talent, if you have chemistry with the guys next to you, if you find 2 guys who play next to each other who work really well together, if you have continuity, if you have guys who get to work together for the full season, if you have coaching, which the Jets don't have, so we can throw that out. Keith Carter's an awful offensive line coach. But if you have like chemistry and continuity, that can make up for like a lack of talent to an extent. You can't have guys who are total zeros out there. But a guy who's maybe just an okay type player, Jonah Williams, you put him next to the right guys, maybe your offensive line can work. George, our old friend George Fant's a good example of that. George Fant went down to Houston this past year and had a good season. Is it because George Fant is a great tackle? No, he's an okay tackle, but they just found the right mix. And that's, I think like one of the things you can do in free agency is you can look at the George Fant situation in Houston where he has a good year and say, well, we got to throw a lot of money at George Fant. Or you can look at it and say, you know what? Maybe it's not all about talent. Maybe it's just about finding the right guys who work together well. And maybe we should find the next George Fant, the next guy who's going to be cheap, who will fit in with what we're trying to do. And maybe Jonah Williams could be that guy. I think that's a really interesting idea. I haven't thought about it much myself, but I actually, I have to say I don't mind that idea. Next question. Could you see a scenario where the Jets fill their pressing needs in free agency and are able to draft the best player on their board with pick 10? Do you see a scenario where trading up would make sense? I think the scenarios where trading up would make sense are very few and far between. Maybe if Marvin Harrison Jr. started sliding down the board. But the problem is the Jets just don't really have resources to trade up. They don't have their second round pick. So, I mean, I just don't know if the Jets are going to have the juice they need to if they want to move up in the draft. I think that's going to be tough. I think that, the scenario I just laid out with Jonah Williams, if you sign a bunch of guys like that to middle tier deals and you at least, take receiver and offensive line from being weaknesses to spots that, look, the Jets don't have enough money to make these positions strengths in free agency, both of them at least. They should be able, if they hit on the right players in free agency, if they find like guys in the middle class of free agency, they might be able to take them to a spot where they're not desperate needs and add that flexibility in the NFL draft, which is something I think they should look to do, because I hate going to the draft feeling like we have a desperate need somewhere, like we absolutely have to use our first round pick at this position. Because that's in a lot of cases, that's where you end up making your big mistakes. And you look back 5 years later and you say, wow, we really messed up there. So I don't want the Jets to go into the draft like saying, like, if we don't get a tackle, it's over. I don't want them to go into the draft saying, if we don't get a receiver, it's over. I think it's gonna be very difficult to go into the draft with both of them as areas of strength. But you can go into the draft saying, like, okay, we feel okay enough about these spots that it's not the end of the world if we don't get somebody at tackle at 10 or we don't get somebody at receiver at 10. That's kind of like the way I see the Jets could do it. Now, I think like you also do have to consider that these are two, not only are tackle and receiver critical needs for the Jets right now, there are also spots where you really do need to invest. You really do need a pipeline of young talent at both of those spots. So it's not just about the immediate. It's like Jets need to find guys who are going to be quality players, high-end players at these critical positions for the next, 7 to 10 years. So that's another thing that factors in. I think that's another reason the Jets should be looking, very hard at tackle and receiver, not just about the here and now, but also about the long run. Jets need, outside of Garrett Wilson, Jets don't really have much long run at either spot. So I don't think that they can address them from the standpoint that you say, like, we're all set. I think they can address them to the point where, like, maybe you say, like, if we have to, we can live with what we've got here. And by the way, like, even like middle class free agents, they should be upgrades over what the Jets have right now. And that's, I guess, one of the things of being so bad at receiver after Garrett and being so bad on the offensive line is that you could sign practically anybody and they're going to be an upgrade, which is, it's not a great thing not a great thing in some respects, but when you get to the offseason, it is a good thing because it means you don't have to do a whole lot to improve. So I think that's where the Jets could end up. Of course, a lot of attention, though, is going to turn to Aaron Rodgers' former teammates because, as we've discussed, Jets really want to make Aaron Rodgers happy. As we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about some players who are former teammates of Rodgers who the Jets could be interested in and whether or not they should be interested in them. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP or bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Next question, John. We know that the Jets brought in many former members of the Packers last year who were teammates with Aaron Rodgers, including Alan Lazard, Randall Cobb, Tim Boyle, Adrian Amos, Billy Turner, not to mention some others. Are there any former members of the Packers who were Rodgers' teammates who interest you this offseason? I mean, not particularly. I'm pretty vocal that I don't want David Bakhtiari. That would not be a good move. There's rumors Aaron Jones may be cut. Jones is still playing decently, but I go back to like what I always say about these older running backs. It always feels like it bites the Jets when they try and sign one of these veteran running backs trying to squeeze one more year out of them. Running back's a young man's position. I'd rather go with the younger guy than the more expensive old guy. I know that like Dalvin Cook doesn't necessarily mean that Aaron Jones is going to be as washed up if he signs with the Jets, but I don't love that idea. I guess I could live with it because he's still playing pretty well, but I don't know. I've had enough of trying to squeeze one more year out of the old running back. We've tried it with Matt Forte, we've tried it with Chris Johnson. It just never seems to work out for the Jets when they try and do something like that. Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who's going to be cut by the Chiefs. I did not want that guy 2 years ago. I thought that would have been the worst signing the Jets could. 2 years ago, they were talking the Jets were going to sign MVS, who went with the Chiefs. He was a former Packers teammate of Rodgers. I thought that would have been a horrible signing 2 years ago. I certainly don't want him now. I guess the guy you could talk me into is John Runyon, who it's not that John Runyon, it's his son. If you're a long-time NFL fan, you may remember the guy that played tackle for many teams, most notably the Philadelphia Eagles when Andy Reid was there. His son has the same name, John Runyon. The older John Runyon, the father, was a tackle. The younger John Runyon is a guard with the Packers. He's not that great. If you want to say like, all right, we're going to spend our money elsewhere. You know what? This guy is going to. We think he can. We'll get him for cheap. We think he could be better than Laken Tomlinson. If he's like the plan B, the plan C, if like you strike out on some of your higher options, then fine. I would not be thrilled with that. I guess I could live with it though. He's not a disaster. I don't think he's great, but I don't think he's a disaster at guard. So maybe that would be the one guy. But I don't really have a lot of enthusiasm for any former Rodgers Packers teammates. I think that the Jets would be well advised to try and sign less guys that used to be Packers with Rodgers than they did a year ago. And our last question, although Corey Davis may not have been a number one receiver like the Jets wanted, he was never paid nor meant to be a number one. Coaching staff and teammates love him, open door policy to come back. How would his contract work if he came back? And wouldn't we want him back since our wide receiver room is Garrett Wilson number one and that's it? I mean, look, I thought when Corey Davis retired, it was a big deal for the Jets. Here's a little behind the scenes stuff. So I remember Corey Davis retired because it was last summer. And last summer, my cousin got married in Greece. So I spent like 2 weeks in Europe. I kind of hopped around Europe a little bit. I spent a weekend in Paris. That was during one of the Jets preseason. I think it was during the preseason game where the Jets played Carolina. Then I went to Greece for a couple of days. And my cousin got married. On the way back, I stopped in London. And I came back to the U.S. My flight home to the U.S. was midday Thursday. So I said, you know what? Before I went to bed Wednesday night, I'm going to pre-record the Thursday show. This will be fine. This will be great. Now I wake up tomorrow. I can go straight to the airport. I won't have to worry about doing the show. So I wake up on Thursday morning. And I say, you know what? I better just check to make sure there was no breaking news overnight. And sure enough, I check and Corey Davis is retired. And of course, like I can't do the show I pre-recorded. A starting player for the Jets is retired. Like I have to re-record a new show about that. So somewhere like in my archives is like the lost episode of Locked On Jets. That show that was originally supposed to go up Thursday, where I pre-recorded it. So I did the Corey Davis show when he retired, and I still made it to the airport. Obviously, I made it back to the States, so no harm, no foul. But I remember when I did that show, I said that it was a big deal for the Jets because he was better than Lazard, and for whatever reason, people didn't seem to agree with me on that. But the Jets did not want Lazard being a top two receiver this past season. It was going to be nothing good was ever going to come out of Allen Lazard being your number two receiver. I think that I'd like to do better than Corey Davis if I can. I think that heading into last offseason, my hope was that they'd be able to upgrade on Corey Davis instead they downgraded by getting Lazard. I think that you can live with him if he wants to come back. If he's like the third or fourth option, I guess that's fine. Like it's not. Look, I mean, it's kind of funny because like a lot of Jets fans thought Corey Davis was terrible. Now suddenly a lot of people are viewing Corey Davis as like the savior of the receiving corps if he's coming back. You got to remember, Davis was not great with this team, and he's been a year away from the game. There's always a risk when a guy misses a full season. I don't think I'd want to count on Corey Davis to be my number two option. Wants to come back, I guess it's fine. He can be a depth guy, but even last year I was hoping the Jets would start the offseason by upgrading on Corey Davis. That would have been pretty nice. How would it work? Well, here's the way it works. Essentially, when a player retires, the contract pauses. And that's it. As long as the team, so the Jets had the option to put Davis on what's known as the reserve retired list. If you do that, essentially what happens when the player retires, his contract we hit the pause button on it. So, and I checked on this because I wasn't sure. But yes, the Jets put Corey Davis on that list, which means essentially if he unretires, his contract just picks up from where it left off. And he had 1 year left on his contract. He was due a $10.5 million salary. So essentially it would be like that $10.5 million he was supposed to make in 2023, the contract would unpause and he'd get that. And this is actually, it's kind of an interesting thing because if you go back long enough, you may remember like Brett Favre's time with the Jets, and people may not realize how he got to Minnesota. What happened was Favre retired after the 2008 season, and the Jets then drafted Mark Sanchez. And the Jets, at that point, the Jets relinquished their rights to Favre. The Jets retained their rights to Favre because of what I just said, because when he retired, his contract paused. But at that point, after the Jets drafted Sanchez, they cut Favre. And the reason they did that was they said, if Favre unretires, we can't afford to pay two quarterbacks a lot of money, because these were the days before the rookie wage scale. Jets had to pay Sanchez like a franchise quarterback because they drafted him so high. So essentially, the Jets would have had to have two high-priced quarterbacks if Favre unretired. So they released him, and that's the reason Favre was able to sign with Minnesota, because once the Jets released him, he became a free agent. So that's the way it works. Essentially, the contract essentially just stops. It doesn't disappear; it just stops. And if the player ever comes back, then it just restarts. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.